Understanding the order of your guitar effects pedals can be a extremely confusing thing for not only beginner players, but even players that have been playing for quite a long time and maybe are quite advanced in their guitar playing. And I'm thinking about one particular pedal, which I find that people often get wrong when they're trying to figure out where to implement it into their signal path. And it's not so much because they've tried it in so many different places to understand the best order, but it's because they actually don't understand what this effect does and how it actually relates to other modulation pedals on a larger scale. And I'm speaking none other than the modulation pedal, the Uni-Vibe. There have been countless reissues and replicas that are very high quality of Uni-Vibes that have come out for decades. However, it seems that a lot of people treat these just like ordinary modulation pedals, because it does say right on the front of most Uni-Vibes, chorus and vibrato. And typically we think of those effects as being something that comes much later in the chain, and certainly after any overdrive and distortions. And I've certainly even seen people use an effect like this, the Uni-Vibe, in an effects loop. And this is highly inappropriate if you actually want to use the circuit in the way that it was originally intended. So today I'm going to demystify for you where the Uni-Vibe really should be used. I'm going to show you a couple of different examples of options of where you can put it, and then tell you about where I think the preferred position of it is based on the type of amplifier you have and how much gain that amplifier happens to have. Now we're going to use three amazing Uni-Vibes built by some of the best vibe builders in all of the world. The first of those is going to be the Sabbadius Funky Vibe. The second one is the R. Weaver Effects Midnight Vibe. And thirdly, we're going to be using the Tinsley Audio Sir Henry Uni-Vibe. So I like to think of there being three places where a Uni-Vibe can realistically live. And the first one is right up front. Guitar goes into Uni-Vibe, and then might follow all the other effects that you might have on your pedal board. Now, a lot of guys who are Uni-Vibe users, whether we're talking about a guy like Kenny Wayne Shepherd that actually uses a Uni-Vibe in this exact position right after the guitar, is that it tends to have a much more subtle sort of response to the other pedals that you might use with it. And if you're going to be using something like a Fuzz, or you're going to be using higher gain overdrives, I tend to actually think that this is the best possible place to put it, which is right after the guitar, because sometimes when you put gain into it, it can sound a little bit like a phaser, and we'll get to hear what that sounds like a little bit later. And I think you maintain the truest authenticity of the sound of the pedal by doing it this way. But another reason to put it first on this particular vibe is that it actually has a feature called a cancel feature, which allows you to maintain the preamp of the Uni-Vibe without engaging the modulation of the Uni-Vibe. And this can be really helpful when you're using something like an old fuzz face or tone bender or zonk machine, and you want to get a little bit of boost to it, but you don't want it to have the consequences that an ordinary boost would have by pushing low impedance into a fuzz face. This is for the same reason you don't use a buffer into a fuzz face. It just doesn't sound right if it's not seeing something that looks like guitar pickups. But the output impedance is so high on these Uni-Vibes, when you leave the preamp engaged, it actually looks somewhat similar to what the guitar pickups might look like, and actually sounds really great boosted and maintains a lot of the elements of that original fuzz face. So let's first off calibrate ourselves to the sound that we're going to be hearing today. I'm going to be using a Marshall Super Lead 100 from the late 60s in my Rory Gallagher Strat. The signal path for this example is going to be guitar, Uni-Vibe, then fuzz, and then it's going to go straight into the front of the Marshall, and we're going to hear a little bit of reverb from the Source Audio Collider just set to a light plate. You're going to hear the clean sound first, just the guitar and the amp. Then you're going to hear the Uni-Vibe engaged, and then I'm going to have the Uni-Vibe engaged and bring in the fuzz, so you get to hear it in a couple of different contexts. And then I'll show you that cancel feature so you can see what happens when you boost up into that fuzz face and how it actually changes the overall tone in a really great way, going into a fuzz that's ordinarily pretty sensitive to anything boosting or hitting it harder. So here's the clean tone. Now let's bring in the vibe and let's hear how that sounds. Now let's go ahead and add the fuzz to that, and let's see how it sounds. This is most certainly the most subtle, and again, not too phasery. The risk that you run, I think, whenever you start involving more gain coming before the Uni-Vibe is that it starts to sound less like a vibe, less throbby, and kind of more high-endy, and kind of has a little bit more sizzle on the top, which I don't find to be as attractive. And especially with something like this Marshall, which is not super high gain, but has a little bit of grit, I think that this is a really great position for your Uni-Vibe, putting it first, then putting any sort of impedance-sensitive stuff like the fuzz after it, and then you would put your fuzz and then your overdrives and distortions, etc., and the way that you would wire the rest of your pedal board. And I think that the other benefit of running in this position is, as I was talking about earlier, using this cancel feature, which bypasses the modulation section of the Uni-Vibe but keeps the preamp active. I want to show you how this sounds boosting into the fuzz. I'm going to be bringing the cancel feature on and off so you can hear what it sounds like in both contexts. And it really does sound amazing and doesn't take away any of the core elements of what makes the fuzz face great. Let's have a listen to that. So yet another reason to consider a vibe like this one, the Sabbadius Funky Vibe 68, or something like the Midnight Vibe, which also has the cancel feature, where you can use that preamp to boost into your fuzz face. It really does sound absolutely amazing. Let's compare it to what happens if we run the fuzz now before the Uni-Vibe, and we run the Uni-Vibe after the fuzz, and then going into the Marshall, and also using the Source Audio Collider for the reverb sounds on this. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to switch this up, and then we're going to come back and recalibrate ourselves to the clean tone, and then hear this in a couple of different contexts. Now let's hear the Uni-Vibe without any other effects. Now let's engage the fuzz going into the Uni-Vibe and hear how that sounds. Now, I know what a lot of people think about this particular position. It tends to be that when you put the fuzz before the Uni-Vibe, it tends to be thought of as the more classic way to wire a Uni-Vibe because that's how Jimi Hendrix used it. The caveat of Jimi Hendrix's setup, of course, is that his Marshalls were highly, highly gained up as much as they could possibly be. When you're going into a really distorted amp, I think it tends to work better for you, especially if you're rolling back on the fuzz a little bit. And a lot of times Jimi Hendrix wasn't even full out on his volume. He kind of had it back down and cleaned up a little bit to play some of those parts that had Uni-Vibe. And a lot of the songs that had Uni-Vibe on them weren't actually as dirty as, say, like Foxy Lady or something like that. I think when we're comparing with just the vibe versus the clean tone, these actually have a very similar sound. Both sound absolutely amazing. They're very subtle and beautiful. But then when you add in that distortion from the fuzz, it does change the characteristic of the Uni-Vibe differently depending on whether the fuzz is first or the fuzz is after the Uni-Vibe. And I think in this particular case, it definitely makes the Uni-Vibe brighter and a little more phasey, like I spoke of before. And you're not able to use the cancel feature like this Midnight Vibe has in order to boost into the fuzz. However, you can still use that to boost into other overdrive or distortion pedals that you have after it. So I want to show you an example of that boosting into a TS9. So I'm going to bypass, again, the modulation section of the Midnight Vibe. I'm going to boost it into a TS9 so you can kind of hear what that does. And I'm just going to turn it on and off and play the same riff twice. Let's hear how that sounds. I think this cancel feature is actually really amazing, and I didn't know many pedal companies that are making Uni-Vibes besides the Funky Vibe and the Midnight Vibe that actually even have the ability to do this, but it's highly useful in that it kind of gives you a boost available on the fly that's super high impedance, but seems to really react well with whatever I throw at it. But let's now go to a third vibe, which is the Sir Henry vibe made by Tinsley Audio. And this one I'm going to place after my overdrive section. So I'm going to have, my fuzz already up front. I'm going to go into all my overdrives, and then I'm going to go into my Uni-Vibe after it, kind of using it in the position that I might use some sort of chorus or modulation in some sort of serial pedal board with all the effects one after the other going in front of an amplifier. So let's have a listen to the clean tone. Now let's bring in the Uni-Vibe. And now I'm going to engage the Tube Screamer going into the Sir Henry. On this example, again, I feel like it was quite a bit brighter when we compared to the very first example. So I really think if you're somebody that wants to get into Uni-Vibe, you want to pay homage to the way that the classic users of the Uni-Vibe might have used it in a current situation where you can't crank a Marshall to its max like Jimi Hendrix did. And again, even tempering that with the idea that Jimi Hendrix really wasn't using Uni-Vibe on super gainy sounds. I think running it first is probably the best idea. Right after the guitar, then going into your fuzzes, your overdrives, distortions, etc. I think this gives you the most flexibility. I'm going to link all of these Uni-Vibes in the description below if you want to check out the Funky Vibe, the Midnight Vibe, or the Sir Henry. I think that they all sound amazing, and I don't think that you could go wrong with any of these. And if you swap these in any of these different positions, you'd get equally great results. I think the X factor here is where the position is going to dictate how the pedal actually sounds. If you want to continue supporting us, the best way to do that is head over to our website, vertexeffects.com. You can purchase a pedal from one of our authorized dealers or our buffer interfaces, which are highly popular right now and are selling out everywhere. Also, if you want a longer form way to participate in a lot of the discussions that we have right here on the channel, me, Grant Klassen, and Brian O'Million have a podcast called Chairman of the Boards. And if you want to buy any custom cables like you see me using today to connect any of the pedals or the guitar and the amplifier, those are all available on therigdr.com. And until next time, I am Mason Marangella, aka the Rig Doctor. And that was my advice on how and where to use Uni-Vibes to get the best possible sound. I'll see you next time. Thank you.